Welcome back. This whole video is about a plant. It's not the biggest plant or the most beautiful plant, although I like it. It's not something that shows up in a lot of gardens. It's not something that you would see at the supermarket or that you eat every day. In fact, you've probably never eaten it. It's not even something that if you spend a lot of time hiking and backpacking that you'd see often in nature. However, it is a plant that is totally integrated with the ecology, the culture, the mythology even of the Pacific Northwest. It's a plant that the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest would have totally relied on for their existence. I'm Muggsy, and today I'm going to explain Camas. In this video, you'll learn absolutely everything you want to know about Camas, including the indigenous history, the ecology, the anatomy, the biological classification, and of course, all about growing, harvesting, and eating Camas, which I'll actually do growing Camas in my own backyard. I'll also visit an actual Camas field several times during the growing season so you can get a feel of what the growing habit and ecology of Camas is all about. So stick around and we'll learn absolutely everything about this amazing plant. Okay, so what is Camas? Camas, or Camassia, is a genus of flowering plants. These plants are monocots. They have just one leaf that comes out of the seed or bulb. They tend to have long parallel veins in the leaves, long, grass-like, lily-like leaves. And they produce these beautiful inflorescences of typically purplish blue or bluish purple, I don't really know the difference, flowers that look very pretty and attract all kinds of pollinators. Some Camases tend to be a little bit more on the blue side of things than the purple, and some are totally white, which can be a problem because those Camases look very similar to their look-alike plant, the death Camas, which grows in the same area as these edible Camases. And as you might guess, the death Camas isn't great to eat. It will kill you. It has been known to kill even animals as big as cows and horses, those sorts of things. It's one of the great challenges of Camas harvesting, avoiding this totally poisonous look-alike plant, the death Camas. So this Camas genus contains, we think, about 6 species. Of course, this is in flux because we're not exactly sure that some of these species are true species or if they can interbreed. We're always kind of fiddling with the numbers in biology, but somewhere around 6 species. 3 or 4 are endemic to the Pacific Northwest, and really there's 2 widespread Camas species in the Pacific Northwest. Camassia quamash, the common Camas that's found all over the Pacific Northwest and is one of the hugely important staple crops of the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest, and the giant Camas, Camassia liclinii, which is much bigger, much prettier because it's got those big showy flowers, and was also important to some indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, but wasn't as widespread, so consumption was a lot more limited. The other Camases are found in other parts of America. The whole genus is endemic to North America. There are no Camas plants endemic to any other part of the world. We used to call Camas the Camas lily because we thought it was part of the lily family. It looks like a lily with these pretty flowers with six tepals and the long lily-like, grass-like leaves coming from a bulb like many lilies do. But nowadays, with genetic evidence, we've been able to take Camas out of the lily family, put it in the asparagus superfamily. I know, it sounds weird, but I'll explain. And in particular, the agave family, like, what we make tequila from, century plants, agave. And this might sound really strange, but when you look at those plants, asparagus and agave, and you look at the stem with flower buds coming out of the ground, that looks exactly like Camas. It also looks exactly like all kinds of hyacinths, which we've also moved out of the lily family and into this greater asparagus superfamily. Asparagus and agave also have leaves that come out of the ground. It's also a monocot, and more importantly, it just bears this genetic stamp of close evolution with the various Camas species. These plants are also endemic to the Americas, so they would have been around the same continent at the same time. So there's all kinds of converging evidence that convinced biologists to take Camas out of the lily family based on what it looks like and into the asparagus superfamily based on actual genetic evidence. And this happens all the time, right? You might say a bird and a bat are closely related because they both fly, but when you investigate closer, you look at the genetic evidence, you look at other morphological features, you would say actually a bird and a bat are related, but they're very distantly related. We're going to put the bird over with the birds, the bat with the mammals. And the fact that they fly is an example of convergent evolution, evolving similar ways of overcoming a problem, flight, even though you're more distantly related. So we have these 6 Camas species. In this video, I'm going to be focusing almost entirely on the common Camas, Camassia quamash, and the giant Camas, Camassia liclinii. Now, Camas gets its name essentially from the Nez Perce people, for whom Camas was incredibly important. Scientists estimate Nez Perce maybe met something like 50% of their nutritional needs from Camas alone, with the other 50% coming from salmon, deer, elk, berries, other roots like bitterroot and yampa, all kinds of other stuff. But Camas was this entire half of their diet. That's kind of typical with a staple food. If you think of Mesoamericans and Eastern Native Americans and their corn consumption, that was probably a huge chunk of their diet. East Asian people with rice, European, Middle Eastern, North African people with bread, all that kind of stuff. So when the Lewis and Clark expedition came west and they encountered the Nez Perce people, the Nez Perce people referred to Camas as quamash. By the way, I'm not a specialist in Native American languages, so I will screw this up. My apologies. And so that's where we get the name Quamash, in Camassia quamash, and other tribes would also say something like Camas, and so it's kind of been anglicized into Camas, even though the Native American names for it were quite different. While researching this video, I watched a lot of Nez Perce people talking about Camas, and they tend to say Cupmis, something like that. Sorry, again, it's not my thing. Cupmis, but you know, we've anglicized it into Camas. So the name Camassia quamash, which is the name of the common Camas, is basically just Camas. It's our anglicized version of Cupmis, Camassia, and then the native name Quamash, which apparently the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition thought they heard the Nez Perce people say. Camassia liclinii, the giant Camas, liclinii just references a German botanist that the botanist who first categorized Camas, I guess, was really into, had a lot of admiration for, so he named the plant after this German botanist. Just north of Portland, Oregon, you can find the town of Camas, Washington. Camas was traditionally a mill town. It's now an upscale suburb of Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington. But long ago, it was home to, as you might imagine, fields of the Camas plant. That's where it got its name. Residents of Camas still honor this tradition with an annual Camas festival, and they maintain several Camas fields around town where you can still see stands of Camas blooming in April and May. The Camas plant once covered much of the Pacific Northwest, but now you can only find it in kind of small clusters because the traditional Camas fields were only maintained by slash and burn agricultural practices by the Native Americans. So they would burn down the forest and then it would become a grassland, a place where you could grow Camas. And then if the trees ever encroached, you could burn it down again and keep your Camas field going that way. And of course, this isn't a practice that was local to the Americas. It was something found absolutely all over the world. This is a great way to reduce tree cover, reduce forests, so you could grow whatever crop you want to, or have grassland for your graze animals, or all kinds of stuff like that. Prior to European colonization, there were a lot of these grasslands in the Pacific Northwest that were maintained by burning the forest down and then letting camas and other related plants grow in. One of these ecosystems is known as the Gary Oak grassland because there's a particular oak tree called the Gary Oak that's endemic to the Pacific Northwest. And you can still see these in various places, even in some cities and parks and stuff around the Pacific Northwest. But they're basically only maintained by either burning or cutting down the trees, preventing them from growing, and creating these little islands of grasslands and other herbaceous plants like camas. A few of these Gary Oak prairies are still visible in various places around the Pacific Northwest, and one of them that I really like to visit is in this town of Camas, Washington. Where better to look for the camas plant than the town of Camas? And so I started my camas journey in March. Now this is a very special place. Check it out. You're looking at a nice open wet meadow, what appears to be grass. But when you get down and look at it, you'll see that these plants are actually members of the lily family, and more specifically, these are camas lilies. This is a field of camas. And right now it's March, so they're not ready to flower yet. It'll take at least another month, probably a month and a half to 2 months to flower. But they're absolutely everywhere. And, you know, before the West was settled and turned into farmland, these camas meadows would have existed all over the place. Now, that's maybe a little bit facetious, not all over the place, but there were quite a few of them. And they were an amazing resource to the local tribes because these camas lilies, their bulb is a great source of carbohydrates. Not only that, they taste sweet when baked. And so, you know, people that had adequate protein from fish or from venison or bison would have really craved something sweet and some carbohydrates as an important part of their diet. And so these camas fields were very coveted. In a 2024 study, researchers at Oregon State University found evidence for camas cultivation going back 3,500 years. Now, not just camas consumption, but camas cultivation. The active burning of woods to produce camas prairies, weeding out death camas, maintaining camas prairies, and of course, slow baking camas in these big field ovens where they would build a big fire, let it burn down to coals, get the stones really hot, put a bunch of camas bulbs on the stones, wrap them in a bunch of other leaves of other plants that are non-toxic, burying the stones underground, and then letting it cook for up to 2 or 3 days. And this method of slow cooking camas in these earth ovens actually represents a great deal of human ingenuity. Because here's the thing, the camas bulb is almost entirely a starch called inulin. And inulin is a dietary fiber, meaning when you eat it, you get no calories. So if Native Americans dug up a bunch of camas bulbs and ate them, they would fart a lot, but they wouldn't actually get any calories. And they would eventually starve to death. But some enterprising person or persons came up with this idea of slow cooking them, which chemically converts the inulin to fructose. Now, fructose has lots of calories. Fructose is a sugar, a carbohydrate. It's what we add to sodas to make them taste sweet. So not only does this make the bulbs taste good, makes them taste sweet, but it actually makes them nutritious, makes them give whoever's eating them calories. And so this slow cooking process, once discovered, kind of spread all around the Pacific Northwest around 3,500 years ago and allowed all these different tribes to use camas as a staple crop to give them this kind of sweet carbohydrate to keep them alive. So the human connection to camas in the Pacific Northwest is incredibly deep and goes back really, really far. Almost every tribe in the Pacific Northwest has myths and legends, stories about the camas plant. And usually it begins with either the creator sprinkling camas bulbs around for his people to eat, or it's some kind of like a Prometheus story almost, where maybe Coyote or some other figure, a fox, will go up to the sky, take camas bulbs from heaven down to earth, so that the people will have something to eat and celebrate each year in the spring when they dig camas, among other bulbs, bitterroot, yampa, that kind of thing. For people west of the Cascade Mountains, where it's a lot wetter, there's a lot more food, there's salmon runs everywhere, they usually had smaller tribal territories. They usually had sedentary villages where they would live full time. These cultures often were really stratified by class, meaning there were high status individuals, medium, low status individuals, and then slaves at the very bottom. And a family could take ownership of a camas plot, and that would bring them a lot of wealth and status. And so they would take care of it, they would weed out the death camas, they would cultivate the camas, and then when it came time for the potlatch season, they would give away much of their camas to their neighbors in the community to maintain their high social status and maintain their position as stewards of that particular camas field. East of the mountains, camas was even more important. West of the mountains, there's lots and lots of salmon, there's seafood, there's all kinds of berries like salal berries, huckleberries, mountain blueberries, salmon berries, all kinds of stuff. East of the mountains, it's much more of a plains, prairie, plateau culture. And so yeah, there's salmon, but often it's a much more seasonal fare. There's also a bigger reliance on hunting, deer, elk, and when you get far enough east, bison. A lot of these cultures, the Yakima, the Spokane, the Wasco, the Nez Perce, etc., heavily relied on the camas plants. For the Nez Perce in particular, there's an estimate that they got about 50% of their calories from camas. And so obviously, cultures like the Nez Perce are going to have a very, very intimate connection with the camas plant. It becomes a very important part of their cosmology, the history of their people, the mythology of their people. And so when settlers came through and started plowing up camas fields, bringing pigs, which are one of the worst things for camas fields because they'll root around in the soil, they'll eat all the bulbs, they'll totally denude a field of all camas so it will never come back. When this started happening, obviously it led to a lot of conflict between these two civilizations. And from my perspective, it sure seems like the Americans, and before them, the British, the Canadians, all these people that came to the northwest of the United States, they didn't understand how important camas was to these native people. The disappearance of camas prairies is important to a great many of the wars that occurred in the late 19th century in the Pacific Northwest amongst the US government and the Nez Perce, the Spokane, the Yakima, all these tribes. One of the most obvious is there's a war called the Bannock War. The Bannock tribe was a relatively new tribe. They were an offshoot of the Northern Paiute, and they were allied with the Shoshone. You remember, Indian tribes are always in flux. They're conquering one another, taking slaves, forming alliances, merging, just like any other group of people anywhere else on Earth throughout almost all of human history. It's not like they got here 20,000 years ago and just chilled in one spot and never changed. Well, this relatively new tribe, the Bannock, like so many tribes, by the 1860s had signed treaties with the US government, and they were kind of moved on to a reservation. Their reservation was at Fort Hall, Idaho. Now, since the camas plant was so important to them, they got in their treaty a few camas fields that would be theirs forever. So they could always rely on having these camas fields as a source of calories and as a source of connection to their cultural traditions that have been that way, perhaps for thousands of years. Well, the early American settlers either didn't understand the importance of the camas fields, or they weren't even aware that these were protected property, and they started grazing their cattle and hogs on these camas prairies. Now, again, not only would this be a massive kind of religious obscenity, but it would be destroying this food source that had been there basically for all of history for these tribes. So the Bannock people, who at this time were already starving, they were having a hard time getting enough food through these agricultural methods, which they were having a hard time adapting to. When they would go out to the Camas fields to get this food that had always been there for them for all of their lives and all of their ancestors' lives, and to find it destroyed, well, you could see that would make them a little upset. That's putting it mildly. They would have been incensed. And one Camas warrior saw some settlers grazing their hogs and cattle on this land that was theirs, that was ceded to them in treaty for all time. And he was so angry he attacked them. And this, one thing led to another, led to the Bannock War. It started with something like 200 Bannock braves, and then they got together with the other surrounding tribes, the Northern Paiute, the Shoshone, until they had, upwards of 600 warriors, until eventually they were defeated by the US government, who were allied with the Umatilla tribe. And again, this whole war represents this misunderstanding between the US government and the American settlers and the tribes that were native to the region about many things, but one particular item of misunderstanding is the Camas fields. The US government and the Americans just didn't realize how important these Camas fields were to so many of these tribes in so many different domains, right? Religiously, culturally, connecting to their parents and their ancestors, and then above all, as a source of vital, vital food to get them through the year. In fact, the famous Nez Perce War, where Chief Joseph famously said, "From where the sun now stands, I shall fight no more forever," was partially brought on by the eradication and loss of these Camas fields. So I hope you can understand how incredibly important it would have been to lose your Camas fields prior to having these crops come over with the Europeans, such as being able to farm wheat and corn and all that kind of stuff, would have meant basically life and death. You would have not been able to make it through the year if you didn't have your Camas fields, your traditional Camas fields that your people would cultivate. Camas starts deep underground, a few inches, as a bulb. This is the part people eat. This is the part of the Camas plant that we're concerned with. The precious place where all the carbohydrates are stored. Now remember, these carbs are indigestible. They're a carbohydrate called inulin when they're in the bulb, but slow roasting will convert them into fructose and glucose, which are much more easily digestible and delicious. Now the bulb is covered in like a thin, papery kind of membrane, kind of like a coat. And since it's kind of like a coat around the bulb, we call that a tunic. Kind of like a shirt or a coat, a tunic. And you might see something like this every time you open up garlic. The garlic's covered in some papery stuff, that's a tunic. If you've ever seen like tulip or daffodil bulbs, those are also covered in tunics. Now out of the bulb, that's where the roots go. And of course, the roots are vitally essential for the life of our Camas plant. They gather the water required to keep the Camas alive and doing photosynthesis. Out of the bulb, we have, like with so many plants, a stem. And then, of course, we also have leaves. Now, the leaves grow directly out of the bulb. And they're kind of long and grass-like. Camas is a monocot, so it usually has these kind of long leaves with veins running parallel instead of all kind of webbed as we might see in a dicot. Just color those in a little bit. And of course, the leaves are the part of any plant that does photosynthesis. So no leaves, no photosynthesis, no sugars, the plant won't survive unless it's a small minority of plants that are kind of like fungi that have evolved to steal nutrients from other things, which are super cool. I'll talk about those maybe in a later video. Okay, so the leaves and the stem grow out of the bulb. Purpose of the leaves, they're basically the engine of the plant that keeps the entire plant alive, that provide the sugars for everything the plant needs to do, to grow, to reproduce, everything it needs to do to stay alive. And let's say this is the ground right here. Now this is a bit of an under exaggeration. What do we call that? I don't know. An underization, whatever. In reality, the bulb is actually going to be a lot deeper underground, and instead of, according to my drawing, it looks pretty close to the surface, but I just don't have enough board space to really draw out a nice big camas the way it needs to be drawn out. So you get it. Okay, coming out of the stem, we have the flowers. And I'll just kind of draw those in a really simplified way. And let's say up at the top, we still have some buds. Now each one of these things is a flower. But collectively, when a plant has a bunch of flowers all together, we call that an inflorescence. Which is just a bunch of flowers all together. You could say a compound flower made out of many flowers. And lots of plants have inflorescences. Unless it's something like a tulip, where it's just one bulb, one set of leaves, one stem, one flower at the top, most plants, many plants, have a bunch of flowers instead of just one. So inflorescences are really, really common amongst plants. And there's several types of inflorescences. This particular type of inflorescence we call a raceme. And a raceme is something like a flower spike, where there's a bunch of flowers attached to the stem in a big long spike. But a spike is a separate type of inflorescence. A raceme is a little bit different from a spike because it has its flowers on this big spike-like long stem, but they're not directly attached to the stem. They're attached to these little tiny stalks which are attached to the stem. And we call each of those little mini stems that attaches a flower to the stem a pedicel. So the camas inflorescence is a bunch of individual camas flowers that are attached through these individual pedicels. Now, the inflorescences raceme, what you'll notice when you look at camas inflorescences is they start blooming at the bottom, and then as the season goes along, these bottom blooms will die off, and then these top buds will open up and it'll start blooming as up, basically moving up the inflorescence. And many camas flowers are also indeterminate, meaning that we don't have a set number of buds at the beginning of the season. If the season is relatively long and it's still nice and wet and there's good sunlight and all that stuff, it can keep producing these top buds, and the flower inflorescence will just get taller and taller and taller, and it can bloom as long as it needs to bloom. This is a pretty good representation of a camas plant, like a Camassia quamish or Leclinii. The only difference is obviously the common camas, the quamish is going to be much smaller, the Leclinii is going to be much bigger. And in particular, what I noticed with my giant camas is that this raceme can get really long, whereas it tends to be just a few flowers in the common camas. In the giant camas, it can be a big long raceme of many, many flowers. Now let's talk about how this plant would actually reproduce. Well, with so many plants, they have two options: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Of course, asexual reproduction is easier. You don't need to find another plant. You can just use yourself. And you don't need to go through the process of making flowers, making fruit, all the different things that plants need to do to reproduce sexually. So what a camas plant would do to reproduce asexually is they would basically just make an offset, or sometimes called a bulblet, but that's also a different thing, which is basically, it would just start growing a clone of this bulb on the bulb itself. So a second bulb would form right there, maybe. And some of these, when I pulled up my Camas to harvest them, some of my Camas bulbs had quite a few of these offsets on them. Some of them are very small, like let's draw one right here that's kind of small. Some of them are really big, almost, you know, getting up there in size compared to the original bulb. So you can think of these as like growths or tumor-looking things, just basically additional little bulblets on our bulb. And of course, this is a great way for the Camas plant to reproduce because it makes a flower, it makes a new plant just right next to it. And next year, after the winter, each of these offsets will grow into their own little Camas plants, which will make their own inflorescences, their own flowers, and have their own lives. Now, you can probably tell by my drawing right here, the big problem with these offsets, one of the big problems, is they're crammed up right against the parent plant. And one thing you want to do when you reproduce as a plant is you want to give your offspring some room to grow, right? Especially if you're still growing, because this additional Camas bulb, the starting Camas bulb, sorry, can grow for many, many years. And so it's still alive. Its kids now have to compete with it. And since it's bigger, it's going to kind of crowd them out a little bit. So this isn't ideal, but it's a good way for a Camas patch to grow, particularly kind of out to the sides around the original plant. But there's a lot of crowding going on with these offsets. The other big problem with these little offsets, these bulblets, is they're clones of the parent plant. And if the parent plant is a perfectly fine Camas who's really good at surviving and reproducing, that's great. But sexual reproduction is almost always preferred to asexual reproduction when it comes to bringing genetic diversity into the species. So it's probably better for this Camas to reproduce sexually with a different Camas plant, to mix all their genes up, and then make a bunch of different offspring that have different combinations of genes that might make them better or worse at surviving. And then of course, the ones that are better at surviving than the parent plant will kind of move the species forward, make it better at surviving whatever challenges the Camas plant is facing: herbivory, changing climate, drought, you know, all kinds of stuff, disease. And so sexual reproduction is really important to plants, and the Camas plant is no exception. And to talk about sexual reproduction, we need to talk about these flowers up here in the inflorescence. And so I'll need to kind of zoom in on those flowers. Okay, let's talk about the specific Camas flower. So the Camas flower itself has 6 what you could call petals. That would be perfectly fine to call them petals. In reality, if you want to get all botanical about it, we don't call these petals. We call these tepals. And the big difference is this. A lot of plants have petals and sepals. Sepals are those little bracts. They're often green below the flower. And then petals are the things on top of the flower that usually make up what we would consider the flower itself. If a plant doesn't have separate petals and sepals, we just call the petal-like things tepals, because there's no separate petals and sepals, there's just tepals. A lot of plants just have tepals. Lilies are a good example. Camas is another example. The tepals are attached to the base of the flower, and the flower is attached to the rest of the plant through, remember, this little thing that we'll call a pedicel. And then the pedicel attaches to the stem where all the other pedicels attach all the other flowers. So this is the stem. And each of these individual things are pedicels. And I guess I'll make the main stem a little bit thicker to really drive this point home. Okay. So there's our Camas flower. Now, at the base of all the petals, this is going to be our female reproductive structure, our pistil. And the pistil is basically 3 carpels all fused together. I'll explain what all that stuff is in just a moment. So this huge thing here is a pistil, which is made of 3 carpels. And I'll have to pull those apart to kind of explain them. We also have 6 of the male reproductive structure radiating around the flower. And those are called stamens. And in the camas, the stamens are basically made of 2 parts. This long kind of stem that attaches, and then this top part that contains the pollen. So this whole structure here is called a stamen. And the stamen, as I said earlier, is made of 2 parts. Down here, this is the filament. And the filament is basically just like a stalk for the stamen. And then up at the top, this is called the anther. And this top part, the anther, is basically where the pollen will develop. And in this camas plant, what happens is it stops looking, I forget what color it is, maybe kind of bluish. And then when the pollen is mature and ready, the plant's ready to go, it turns bright yellow. So the camas plant looks pretty neat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay. In that it has these nice kind of bluish purple or purplish blue, I don't really know. Everyone has strong feelings about this. Petals contrasting with these really bright yellow anthers with the pollen when the plant is mature. It makes it a really striking looking plant. I really like the way it looks. Okay, in order to talk about the female part, we're gonna kind of pull that apart separately. So I said this is a pistil and it's made of 3 fused carpels. Let's talk about just an individual carpel. So an individual carpel would look just something like this. At the top, we have this thing called the stigma. And the stigma is essentially a landing pad for pollen. Sometimes it's sticky, sometimes it has some liquid on it to help in that process, just like a pollination drop in gymnosperms. And then this middle part here, that's kind of like a long stem, we call that the style. And I always remember, if you think of like an old school pen as a stylus, a style is very similar. It's just kind of a long pen right here. And then at the bottom, this is the ovary. Ova meaning egg, of course. And inside the ovary, there's some number of ovules. It kind of depends. In camas plants, it's often, I think, like 2 to 6, but it changes. And the ovules are just like a more specific chamber for keeping and developing the eggs. So inside the ovules, that's where the eggs are. Okay, so pollination basically happens like this. Some pollinator, in my experience, it's largely bees that pollinate camas, but it can be butterflies, it can be flies, it can be all kinds of different animal species. Will land on the flower to get some nectar down here at the base of the flower. The nectaries are kind of down here around the ovary. And they're also attracted to the color of the camas plant. And in doing so, they'll get this kind of powdery pollen stuck on their body. Then they'll go to a different camas flower, hopefully on an entirely different camas plant. So you get two genetically unrelated parents. And the pollen will get deposited on top of one of these 3 stigmas. And then the pollen will form what's known as a pollination tube. This is a common reproductive structure in angiosperms that'll go down, 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 all the way down the style into the ovary, into particular ovules, and it'll deposit the sperm into those ovules, and it'll fertilize those eggs. And then eventually the ovary will then grow and develop into the fruit. Now, people get really confused with angiosperm fruits, the fruits of flowering plants. They understand berries and apples and grapes and things like that. But for instance, dandelion fruits, grass fruits, all kinds of kind of dry seed head fruits. They don't really understand that that's a fruit, but understand that there's all different kinds of fruits, and many of them aren't fleshy, they're not sweet, they're not good to eat. They're just made to basically contain the developing seeds and then maybe open up to spread the seeds when the time's right. And that's certainly what's true in our Camas plant. So what's going to happen is this ovary is going to kind of swell and develop into the Camas fruit. At the same time, the rest of the Camas flower will fall off because it's not needed. Once fertilization happens, these petals can dry up, shrivel, fall off. Same thing with all the stamens, they can dry and fall off. And then we'll just be left with this main ovary here. The stigma and style will kind of shrink or fall off until they're not left at all. And the ovary will just kind of grow into this big oval looking fruit that's still attached to the main stem through a pedicel. And we'll see later on in the season, as the flowers go away, we'll see lots of these Camas fruits. The Camas fruits are super cool. They're divided into 3 chambers, basically. And they will basically swell, swell, swell until they open up like those eggs in Alien, the facehugger eggs. And it'll kind of split open like that. And then you can look inside and see the really nice dark seeds that have developed from the fertilized eggs down in the ovaries, in the ovules in the ovary. And then eventually it'll split open enough that the seeds will just fall out of the plant. Or maybe it's a particularly windy day. This is a really good scenario for the plant, maybe the best case scenario. The wind will kind of blow the seeds out of the fruit, and then they'll get deposited further away from the plant. So sexual reproduction produces these seeds. Asexual reproduction produces these bulb offsets. The advantage of sexual reproduction is you have a totally unique individual now. And maybe that new Camas plant isn't going to be very good at surviving, but then natural selection will just kill it off over time. It'll become less and less common in the population until it's gone. But maybe on some slim chance you produced a brand new combination of genes, or maybe some new genes via mutation, that are better at surviving than all the other Camas plants in the population, in which case natural selection is going to cause this new Camas plant that comes out of this seed to become more and more prevalent in the Camas population over time, and maybe the key to Camas's survival in an ever-changing world. So that's a big advantage right there. The big advantage of asexual reproduction is, first of all, it took a lot less energy to make this bulblet in general. We didn't need to produce flowers, we didn't need to produce pollen, we didn't need to produce eggs, we didn't need to have the pollen fertilize the egg, we didn't need to produce fruit and seeds and all that kind of stuff. We just needed to kind of put some extra sugars down into our bulb and kind of split it off into a little mini bulb. So there's a big advantage to asexual reproduction as well. Remember, we humans, we can only do sexual reproduction, but many plants, including Camas, can do both. And frankly, I think sexual reproduction is so fun and interesting, right? Like, it would be boring if all your kids were just clones of you. It's really neat to make totally unique humans and see this kind of mix that you create with your husband or wife, your partner. I think that's just so neat and so interesting. One of the wonderful things about human reproduction. But Camas can do either of these. The big downside to these seeds is it's going to take them a while to grow. Like, stored up in this bulblet, in this offset, is a lot of sugar. And so the very next season, it can kind of produce some roots real quick. It can produce some leaves really fast, using up the stored energy in that bulb. It can even produce flowers in that very first season. Whereas this seed is going to take a lot longer to grow. So when it germinates, it'll be able to produce a few small roots. It'll be able to make some really small leaves that almost look like grass. They're so small. And if it's lucky, if it gets a lot of water, and in particular a lot of sunlight, it can do a lot of photosynthesis, store up energy, and then by the end of the season, make its own bulb. And then the seasonal cycle of Camas is it does the bulk of its growing in spring. By early summer, it's already kind of stopped its growth cycle, and it's just focused on everything dying back and putting all its energy into this bulb for the next year. So all the leaves, the flowers, the roots will all die off and we're left with just a bulb. Now again, this offset is now an even bigger bulb because it kind of hit the ground running because it started as a relative bulb. But this seed is now also a little bulb. Remember, it started as a seed, but after its first year growing, it's now a bulb. So now the second year growing, it can hit the ground running itself and make some bigger leaves, bigger roots, maybe even have its own inflorescence, although that might take a few years to get enough energy to produce its own flowers. So the seeds, remember, even though they have all kinds of cool new mixed genes, it's going to take them a while to actually produce a big flower inflorescence and also to produce big bulbs because it's starting out so small. There's not a lot of stored sugars in a little tiny black seed. There are a lot of stored sugars in a nice big bulb. Okay, here we are just 1 month later. It's April 25th. Check it out. In 1806, Meriwether Lewis wrote this in his journal about the Camas fields of the Nez Perce people of Idaho and Eastern Oregon. The Quamash is now in bloom, and from the color of its bloom and at a short distance, it resembles lakes of fine, clear water. And this was totally my experience as well. It's really beautiful seeing these Camas fields in full bloom. Up close, you can see the really visually striking, beautiful flowers with their nice purplish blue tepals and their really bright yellow pollen on their anthers. And then when you step back and look at it from a distance, you do get this kind of lake effect where all the blue kind of runs together and it looks like you're just looking at some water at a lake or something like that. It's really neat, really cool. It's a little sad almost to see the Camas fields in full bloom, appreciate the beauty of this spectacle, and know that it's very limited. There's small discrete places where you can go to enjoy Camas, whereas hundreds of years ago there would have been much more of it all over the place. Now, this is a little bit there is kind of a naturalistic fallacy here because this isn't even a widespread natural ecosystem, right? The Camas ecosystems, these Gary Oak prairies, really only exist as a result of fire. And of course, fires would have happened naturally, and these prairies would have happened naturally. But having big, semi-permanent, managed Gary Oak prairies that were full of Camas, that was really only brought about by human intervention. So these were almost a form of indigenous gardening in the American West. I'd like to see more of these intentionally maintained Gary Oak prairies across the Pacific Northwest. Like I said, there are some to be found, but it'd be cool, like near urban centers particular, to have these places where people can go and enjoy everything there is that's going on there. And by the way, it's not just Camas blooms. There's so many different species of other flowers and plants here. They're absolute hotspots of diversity. It's kind of, let's say, a little bit ironic. People expect deep, high, very old growth forests to have huge diversity. They have a lot, but these disturbed habitats like this Gary Oak prairie actually has more diversity of plants within it because they're all these smaller plants struggling for survival with one another in this area. So in these Camas fields, I saw Camas, to be sure, but I also saw Trillium, Columbia lilies, avalanche lilies, glacier lilies, there's fritillaria, there's all kinds of grasses, there's all kinds of lichens, mosses, there's these Gary Oaks, there's other trees. It really is an amazing place, and so I'd like to see more of them around the Pacific Northwest. I had a really good time visiting the Camas fields, and in fact, I would go back later, about a week later, with my wife and daughter, and we got to enjoy it again. But at that point, the bloom was kind of starting to ebb. There's kind of a peak bloom, and I think these videos right here represent peak bloom. And then these videos here represent when I went back a little while later, and it was kind of, the flowers were still there, but there were fewer and fewer of them as the field was starting to dry up. The basic seasonal life of a camas flower is they grow like crazy in the spring when it's wet in these meadows, in these prairies. And then as the soil starts to dry up, they kind of get the signal to finish blooming. Their leaves start to die. They send all their sugars down into the bulb, and then the whole plant dies off by, let's say, June, and then lies dormant underground for the rest of the year, basically until the next February, March, when it starts growing again. So these plants have a very short growing season in what is a long year. And it's a great strategy because they can grow at the wet time of year, not worry about the dry time of year, and they don't have to compete with the other plants that grow in kind of midsummer because they're already done growing at that time. This is a good opportunity to talk about the general life cycle ecology of the camas plant. Remember, camas grows from a bulb. And in fact, basically from, let's say, June to January, February, the camas plant basically just exists as a dormant bulb in the ground. Even if you walk around the camas field and you see some kind of like dead leaves above the ground, well, that's not really doing anything for the plant, right? Leaves need to be alive, they need to be green, they need to be actively doing photosynthesis for the plant to be collecting sugars. So by late May in some cases, early June, the plant is no longer doing photosynthesis, it's just kind of dying back and sending sugars from all the dying parts of the plant, the leaves, the roots, the flowers, down into the bulb to store those sugars for the long, cold American winters. Now, once spring comes along, February, March, what's going to happen is the bulb, and bulb plants are really cool in that they get an early start. So when you think of all the different small flowers that bloom early in the year, tulips, snowdrops, crocuses, daffodils, they all have bulbs. This is part of a larger strategy, because what a bulb does is you have a bunch of stored up energy underground in the bulb so the plant can start growing faster than any other plant. Plants that don't have stored energy in a bulb need to wait until it's nice and warm and really sunny and nice and wet to get going. Whereas bulbs can start where there still isn't a lot of sunlight, where it's still very cold, when conditions are more or less suboptimum, because they have all this stored energy to get them going. And so February, March, the camas plant's gonna use the energy in the bulb to make roots, to make its stem, more importantly, to make its leaves that are gonna come out of the ground and start collecting sunlight for photosynthesis. Now, usually where I live in the Pacific Northwest and where there's a lot of camas, we have really wet springs. And even in the drier parts of the Pacific Northwest, where there's lots of common camas, Eastern Oregon, Idaho, Montana, the slopes and meadows can be kind of wet in the spring. That's kind of the only time of year you would consider those parts to be wet. They're incredibly dry during the summer. And so in particular, in these kind of inland Pacific Northwest camas meadows, it's important to grow in the early spring when there's moisture, because there isn't going to be any moisture in the summer, basically. So the camas plant will take in as much sunlight as it can. It'll kind of deplete the bulb a little bit, so the bulb will shrink during this time because it's using its energy, its sugars, to make these leaves, roots, all this kind of stuff. And so the bulb will essentially go away during this time of year, for the most part, while the plant produces its leaves. Eventually, when it's produced big enough leaves and done a lot of photosynthesis, it'll send up its stem, it'll make its inflorescence, it'll have its flowers bloom, it'll do sexual reproduction. And then eventually, when you hit late May, late June, the entire plant will say, I've gotten enough energy, let's start diverting all this energy into the bulb. And so the bulb will get bigger and bigger again. It'll expand as sugars go from the leaves down into that bulb, and as water goes from the roots down into the bulb. And then eventually when the bulb gets big enough and it gets late enough in the spring, early summer, all of this stuff will die off. The inflorescence will have done its thing. It will have maybe made seeds at that point. The leaves will shrivel and drop eventually, until eventually you have a new bulb. And that bulb will sit in the ground during the dry part of the summer, during the fall, during the winter, and the next spring it'll be ready to go again, hitting the ground running. So this tells you a little bit about the ecology of the camas. It likes wet meadows that can grow in the springtime. It doesn't actually matter if there's no moisture in summer, because the camas is done growing by summer. So it can grow in areas that seem really dry when you're there in the summer, but are still relatively wet in the spring. Well, here I am in June. Take a look. So as you can see, it didn't take long for the blooms to die, for the plant to turn brown and die back, basically all the way to the ground. The camas plants fruited, the fruits dried and turned brown and opened up. Most of them spilled the black seeds out, but a few of them still have some seeds rattling around in them. At this point, the camas field is basically unrecognizable from a month earlier when it was a sea of blue, or a few months earlier when it was a sea of green. There's lots of other plants, mainly grasses, but other flowers growing above the camas. And eventually the camas will just disappear altogether and will only exist as a bulb underground for the rest of the year until next early spring. I did manage to find a few deaf camas plants in this camas field. So this is a perfect illustration that often where there's camas, there's deaf camas. And if you're not there to weed out the deaf camas, then when you dig a bulb, it could be a camas bulb, it could be a deaf camas bulb. You really don't want to take that gamble. As a kid, I was obsessed with foraging wild plants. I had every book I could get my hands on, including a bunch that I inherited from my dad and even my grandparents, who also had a similar obsession. It's just kind of our family vibe. We're really into science and nature and that kind of stuff. And you can see some of these books are super well loved, because I would take them out backpacking and try and find everything that I could to eat. You'll notice, take a look at the camas entry, it says the lily family. That's incorrect, but it just goes to show that not very long ago, scientists all thought camas was a lily. It was a member of the lily family. Its movement into the agave and the asparagus superfamily is a much more recent phenomenon. So it just goes to illustrate how much in flux biology is, and in all science for that matter. We're just kind of going off what we know now until we know something better. And even now, we're not exactly 100% sure camas is in the right family. This is just where we have it placed based on the best current available evidence, which I just love about science. It's so humble and it's continually evolving, not making claims that it can't back up at present. Okay, that's an aside. Let's get back to my obsession with foraging wild edibles. Basically, if you're my friends and family and you've been on backpacking trips with me, I've probably offered lots of weird, strange edible foods for you to eat, from something as simple and delicious as huckleberry to something a little bit more challenging like the nice sour tang of a sheep sorrel leaf or something like that. It's pretty common for my wife and I, when we go backpacking, I'll add in some wild onions to our dehydrated mountain house meal or something like that. I like to integrate wild foods as we're out in nature, as long as I'm not disturbing like a particularly vulnerable population or something like that. There are also a lot of wild foods that are just, I would say they're edible, but they're not palatable, so why bother with them? But other ones, like huckleberries, Miner's lettuce is one I really enjoy. The more delicious mushrooms like morels and chanterelles, lobsters, cauliflowers, all that stuff are not only edible, but they're absolutely delicious. So those we pretty much eat every time we see them. Camas, though, for the longest time has eluded me. And this is for a lot of reasons. The main reason is that Camas isn't really found at all the places where I tend to go backpacking. Nowadays, most of our wild lands are in mountains because these lands were kind of more difficult to develop. People didn't just like set up farms on top of Mount Rainier, for example. And also because they have such amazing scenic beauty, because they're such fragile and ephemeral ecosystems. So a lot of times when I'm out in nature, I'm up above a certain elevation, and Camas tends to be down in the wet meadows. It's also true that where Camas historically lived is where cities, farms, housing developments are all nowadays. So even though Camas was super abundant at the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition, for example, now much of Camas an is just the world that we live in. It's all the big cities of the Pacific Northwest, all the towns, the farms, that kind of stuff. So there's kind of an irony that the plants that were kind of on the margins up in the mountains and stuff are much more visible nowadays when you go explore nature. And the plants that were just around everywhere else in the valleys and the grasslands, all that kind of stuff, are actually much harder to find. The other thing is, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, our hiking season is like July, August, September. Camas is totally done flowering by late May in many cases. So there's no chance you would see Camas while it's in flower. And, you know, if you're hiking and you see something that looks like a dead Camas plant, I wouldn't dig it up and eat the bulb, because we all know Camas without its flowers looks just like death Camas without its flowers, or any number of other plants. So you really have to have a continuity with your Camas field, right? So either you're out there actively maintaining your Camas field, you're removing all the death Camas, or you're doing what I do and you're just growing your Camas in your garden where there isn't any death Camas. So for years, I've had this dream of harvesting and eating Camas. As I said earlier, it's just not practical to go out and forage Camas in the wild because it just doesn't grow in a lot of public lands anymore, especially those up in the mountains. And it's just totally unethical to go forage Camas from these special Camas preserves, like this one in Camas, Washington, but they're all over, you know, there are quite a few all over the Northwest. But you shouldn't go there and forage Camas. It's a gross thing to do because that's a resource that we all share. And more than that, at least at the one at the preserve in Camas, Washington, there's death Camas actively growing. So not only should you not go forage Camas from these public places because you're going to, you know, take Camas away from other people, but you could die, because death Camas is deathly poisonous. That's why they call it death Camas. Poisonous enough to kill you or I. Even horses and cows can die from eating death Camas. It is no joke. Death Camas is in its own separate genus, and its genus name, you're gonna love this, is Toxicoscordion. Toxicoscordion. Just to let you know that this plant is super toxic. And in fact, its full name is Toxicoscordion venenosum. And if that doesn't sound like something you shouldn't eat, Toxicoscordion venenosum, then I don't know what is. So this goes a long ways to say it's hard and impractical and in some cases unethical to forage Camas. So the next best thing is to grow it yourself. So I purchased some Camas bulbs 2 years ago and planted them in my garden. And this year I finally have enough Camas that I'm going to be able to dig some up and eat it. So this is a fulfillment of a lifetime dream for me, however humble that might seem. So 2 years ago, I started my personal journey with Camas by planting Camas bulbs in my garden. I ordered common Camas bulbs from a plant company in New York, And I got my giant camas plants from actually my local nursery, which has a good selection of local plants on hand. The giant camas in particular is popular with gardeners that are into native plants in the Pacific Northwest. So it's not unusual going around Seattle or Portland or Vancouver, BC to see giant camas in people's gardens, especially people that are really into native plants. They were kind of expensive because they're not very common plants. And so I grew them for a couple years, enjoyed their flowers, let them reproduce asexually via their bulbs underground. And then this year I got, a pretty big crop. So I decided my camas crop was big enough that I could actually dig up some bulbs, cook them and eat them, and still have plenty of bulbs to keep my garden going. So you can see it starts here's my garden in March. And we're starting to see some of the growth of the camas plants from their bulbs. They're forming these kind of distinct clusters of bulbs, and that's because each bulb reproduces asexually, so it forms bulb offsets, little bulblets all around it. And so what was one bulb 2 years ago, last year was, let's say, 2 or 3 bulbs, and this year is in many cases 8 or 9 bulbs all kind of clustered together in one spot. And in fact, when I dig up my camas, I'm going to kind of break up all those clusters and spread them out, which will make my camas plants have more room to grow. It'll give me a lusher, fuller camas patch. So let's take a look. So in my garden, just as I get back from the camas fields, and we see those camas plants just starting to come up out of that wet soil, the same thing is essentially happening in my garden at home. My camas plants are just starting to come up. Going into April in my garden, we see the camas plants starting to put up their main stem that's covered in unopened flower buds at this point. And it really does look like other members of the asparagus family. It looks like, a stalk of asparagus or a hyacinth or an agave before they bloom. And then, by mid to late April, the buds had started to turn purple and open up. And just about the same time that the big bloom was happening at the camas field in Camas, Washington, I was having a nice bloom in my garden as well. They were really pretty and I really enjoyed them, and they occupy this great blooming period, in my garden at least, where it's after all my spring blooms, daffodils, tulips, that sort of thing, crocuses, but before my summer blooms, hydrangeas, dahlias, gladiolas, all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of nice having this like mid-spring blooming flower. And again, they add this really nice blue-purple color to your garden. I highly recommend growing camas, especially if you live in an area where camas grows native, because you're also supporting native pollinators, which is a win-win. These Lichliniae, you can really see the progression of flowering. So at the top, we just have flower buds. And then as we move down, we get to the actual flowers that have matured and have pollen on their anthers. And then below that, we get the old flowers that have now started to wilt. And at the base of those flowers, you can see the ovary has started to kind of swell and become a little bit rounder and plumper. That's not the case up here. And eventually that ovary is going to totally swell and mature into the fruit that contains the seeds. And then eventually it'll turn brown and fall off altogether. In May, I still had some lovely inflorescences, but as the month started to go along, the flowers would all drop their tepals. We'd see the kind of swollen ovary get bigger and bigger and bigger until it formed the camas fruit. And so I'd be left without any camas flowers at all by the end of the month, just tons of camas fruits that were starting to kind of turn yellow and dry up. By early June, even though I water my garden so the camas didn't fully dry out, it had basically turned yellow and the leaves had all drooped. The flowers had all gone to seed, and in many cases the seed pods, the fruit, had dried these capsules and split open, and you could see the nice shiny black camas seeds inside. And so By early June, it was time to consider harvesting my camas, which, let's be real, I had been waiting for all year. I was really excited to get in there and actually see what these camas bulbs looked like. All right, so it's a nice hot day in June, and as you can see, let's take a look here. My camas plants are nice and dry. They've kind of turned yellow to brown. I think they're ready to harvest. So let's pull a few. So this one here by this tomato plant, you see it's all dry. The foliage is wilted. The seed pods are pretty much all gone at this point, so we can just get in there with our hands and dig it up. Now in the wild, you'd probably need a stick, but in my garden bed, the soil's pretty loose, so you can just pull them right up. There you go. That's a nice pull there. And you can see every bulb often has these little bulblets on it. And that's, how the plant reproduces asexually. So let's just keep pulling them. Pulling up the camas clumps was actually a lot of fun. I like this sort of thing. Also, I love pulling up potatoes. It's kind of like gambling or fishing. You never know what you're going to get. And some of these clumps were massive. They were just full of camas bulbs. Like some had maybe 15 bulbs or so. And then it was also fun to kind of tease those apart. Remember, these clumps happen from asexual reproduction. So as the years went along, the camas bulbs were making offsets, and those offsets were making offsets until we just end up with these big clumps. It's one of the advantages of seeds is that they can be dispersed a little further away, whereas these offset clumps can only happen, directly next to the camas plant. So they're not really effective at utilizing the whole space of my garden. That's why when I'm done harvesting these guys, I'll take my reject bulbs that are too small to eat and I'll spread them out in my garden as a way of kind of, spreading out my plants more uniformly instead of just having them in these tight little clumps. The giant camas plants were actually pretty hard to dig. Their bulbs are a lot deeper in the ground and the roots are stronger, so I needed to use a trowel on these guys and really dig them out. But it was also so satisfying because these bulbs are so huge compared to the common camas bulbs. They're maybe about 4 times bigger. So it's really fun to dig up these huge clumps of giant camas bulbs. And these guys, I just don't have very many of them. So I'm probably just going to try one of them as far as eating's concerned, and then I'm just going to spread out the rest of the bulbs in my garden to keep growing my collection. So this is that big cluster. Look at that. That's crazy. I'm just going to break that apart. Maybe separate out some of the bigger bulbs from some of the smaller bulbs. Wow, look at this. So there's some decent sized bulbs here and a lot of these little ones. So this will be good for replanting to replenish my stock. And these aren't big, but maybe big enough to eat. I'll roast them up anyway. This is a good sized bulb. This is probably my best, one of my better sized camas bulbs. Right, after sorting them, you can see this is what I'm left with. I've got my kind of smaller ones over here, and my bigger ones for cooking over here. So these ones I'm going to use to roast, and these are the ones we're going to eat. And over here, we got the real little ones, some as small as like this. You can see there's some really tiny ones in here. And these are basically going to be replanted. Start here. Just kind of plop some in. I also cut a bunch of my Camas seed heads, put them in a brown paper bag, and basically shook out the black seeds to collect Camas seed for next year, and also to just give to any friends I had that wanted to grow their own Camas from seed. Now, growing Camas from seed takes a while longer because they start out as a small seed instead of a bigger bulb, but it's still a great way to add Camas to your garden, and it tends to be a lot cheaper. Well, here we are after harvest with my giant Camas bulb and my common Camas bulb. And when you look at these guys, the size difference is striking. This giant Camas bulb, the Leclinii, is about maybe 4 or 5 common Camas bulbs when you take into account the total mass of the bulb. It's about twice as tall, as you can see, but about 4 or 5 times the mass. So these guys would make a lot more food than these guys. Unfortunately, I only grew a few of these guys because I started with only 3 plants that I got at my garden store. They're pretty expensive. So I want to keep all of these that I can to multiply them. I'll cook one of them to try, but the rest I'll keep so I can increase my patch size. But my common Camas, I've got a lot of these and a lot of seed, so we'll be cooking up a big batch of these and eating them, and then everything else will be going back in the garden and becoming next year's crop. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the Camassia Leclinii, the giant Camas, here on the left, and the common Camas, Camassia quamash, here on the right. Okay, I've got all my Camas bulbs here, and I'm going to try and clean them off to get all the crud off of them. You can see they're covered in this skin here. So I'll do what I can to get rid of it. It was actually really hard to get the tunics off these Camas bulbs and really scrub them well. It took the better part of an hour, even with running water and a knife. So if you know a better way to do this, let me know in the comments. Okay, I have a little uncooked Camas bulb here, and I wouldn't recommend this, but I'm gonna eat this. Now, they can make you feel sick if you eat a bunch of them because it's basically full of indigestible fiber, inulin. But just to satisfy our intellectual curiosity, I'll try some right now. Super crunchy. Doesn't taste like anything. Kind of like eating jicama or something like that. Kind of mucilaginous too, like onion skin, you know, when it's all slimy underneath. It's not bad, just doesn't really taste like anything. So yeah, let's see what happens when we cook this guy. Once they were all scrubbed and ready to go, then I could finally cook my Camas bulbs. Now remember, for 4 millennia or so, the preferred method of cooking Camas bulbs are these pit ovens, where you make a big fire, you get the hot rocks from the fire and you line a pit underground. You take your Camas bulbs and you wrap them in a packet of various edible leaves from local plants like salal or whatever's around, grasses and sedges. You put that on the hot rocks, you put more hot rocks on top, you put a bunch of earth on top of that, and then you leave it for 2 to 3 days. The moisture in the leaves will steam the bulbs and keep them moist as they cook underground in this nice hot oven. Now, my HOA and my wife probably aren't too thrilled about the idea of me making a big bonfire in the backyard and digging it up, so instead I opted to use a slow cooker, which is the preferred way of doing it nowadays. With a slow cooker, you can just use like a dumpling steamer is what I used, and a layer of water underneath that dumpling steamer to steam the bulbs just like the plants would do in the pit oven. And you cook it for somewhere in the order of 2 to 3 days. For me, 2 days was fine. By the end of 2 days, these bulbs were dark and ready to eat. Again, you can really let color be your guide with Camas bulbs. They start out almost pearly white,
and they get darker and darker the longer they cook. You really want them to be a nice dark brown color by the time you're ready to eat them. When you cut into them, they almost have a gummy consistency. Here's what my buddy Tom thought of the taste.
There's a little bit of a sweet
Good thing.
smell.
Okay.
Water chestnut, kind of, maybe not. No, just chestnut. Straight up chestnut.
Nutty, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what people say. That's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, a little gummy. It's good.
Let me try one.
Yeah.
And most people that I had try the Camas liked it. They thought it was pretty good, pretty sweet. My 2-year-old daughter really liked it, had quite a few. There is like, it's not quite like eating chocolate or some delicious candy or something like that. There is kind of an off taste in it a little bit. Same with eating like roasted chestnuts. So I think it has a hard time living up to like our modern foods. Like if you were to go get Korean barbecue or something like that, or a really fancy cheesecake, or you know what I'm saying. But that being said, it was still pretty good. Once we'd all tried Camas, I smashed it up with a meat tenderizer into little patties, and I fried a few of these in some olive oil, put some salt on top, and those were actually quite good. That was kind of like eating fried plantains or something, but I would say even better. I'm not a huge fan of fried plantains, but similar kind of thing. Although I guess most things are pretty good when you fry them in oil and put some salt on them.
So after steaming my Camas in the slow cooker for 2 full days, smashing it, drying it in my food dehydrator for something like 8 hours, I'm left with these kind of neat little Camas patties, or little Camas cakes, you know, flattened, squished, dried Camas. And they're pretty good. They're really tough, but it has that sweet Camas flavor, like a chestnut with just a hint of molasses maybe, and then a little something extra that's kind of an off taste that I don't love, but overall, it's pretty good. It's sweet. I don't think it can really keep up with our modern snacks, you know, like some Cheetos or something delicious like that. But it's pretty good. It's fun for me to kind of imagine what it would be like to be an early indigenous person in the Pacific Northwest and going on a hunt or something, and I have a bunch of these dried Camas cakes in my bag, and whenever I get hungry and need a snack, I can pull one out and kind of chew on it, or I could just kind of eat one as I go, as I follow the elk or whatever it is I happen to be hunting. While researching this video, I saw a lot of firsthand accounts of Nez Perce people that would say that their grandfather used to go hunting and he would bring dried Camas with him, and it was his favorite snack, which is pretty cool. I'd say most people enjoyed the Camas. It's a little better fresh steamed than it is dried, right? It's kind of tough when it's dried, but it's shelf stable, which is really neat. So it's not going to go bad. I can keep this for a long period of time. I'm not sure exactly how long, but I think basically a lot of Plateau Indians would keep Camas around from basically May until February when they needed new Camas, right? So you had fresh Camas in like May and June, and maybe throughout the summer you could just dig up bulbs that are dried underground. And then in the fall you would dry the Camas, and then you would eat dried Camas or Camas flour or other products made from the Camas over the winter and early spring until you're ready to start harvesting some new Camas again, which would have been a pretty cool, pretty exciting event for the whole tribe. So yeah, on my next backpacking trip later this summer, I'll bring this dried Camas with me instead of my usual, you know, granola and candy bars and that kind of stuff. And just to, I don't know, like LARP as an early indigenous person in the Pacific Northwest, and imagine what it would be like to live back then and go on a big long trek with just these dried Camas to tide you over. So pretty cool. I'd say this whole experience has been pretty interesting for me. Like I said, it's something I've been thinking about ever since I was a kid. And so it's really neat to go through the process of growing, digging, processing, cooking, and now consuming Camas. I'm not sure it's something I would do every year going forward. It's just not as delicious to me. Maybe I haven't acquired the taste as like potatoes or tomatoes or green beans, the other things that I grow in my garden, corn. So I think I'm gonna keep growing Camas in my garden just because it's beautiful. It occupies this kind of neat blooming period after tulips and daffodils and that kind of stuff, but before all the summer blooms, dahlias, gladiolas, that kind of stuff. And of course, it is good for native pollinators, native bees and that kind of stuff. So there's lots of great reasons to grow camas. And then maybe every few years or so, I'll dig it up, prepare it, cook it, all that stuff, and treat my friends to this weird, unique experience that they can't really have anywhere else. So yeah, camas, amazing.
So what's the future of camas going forward from here? I really see, I guess, three main avenues for the camas plant in the future. The first one's kind of obvious, and that would be cultivation amongst indigenous communities. So tribes either continuing to cultivate camas as they have for millennia, or tribes that have gotten out of the habit of cultivating camas, getting back into that habit to kind of create traditions for their kids and their grandkids and all that sort of thing. I think this is already happening, and I think in the future it's only going to happen more and more, which will be great. It'll be great to have more camas fields out there in the Pacific Northwest, and I love the idea of people connecting to their culture, connecting to their ancestors, and sharing their traditions with their kids and grandkids. The second avenue for camas in the future, I think, is basically what I did. These are great garden plants. So I think we're going to see more and more people, especially in the Pacific Northwest, but you can grow this plant anywhere pretty much. It grows, I think, zones 3 to 8. So that's a big part of the United States, Canada, and all over the world. You could grow it in Europe, lots of people do, Asia, etc. It also, is great for pollinators, particularly native pollinators, if you live in an area where camas is native. And you can just keep it as a survival food if you want. You never have to eat the camas. You can just enjoy its flowers. But if you are a weirdo and want to cook it in your crock pot and serve it to some of your friends like I did, I think that's a fun thing to do. You can give people an experience that they probably haven't had and wouldn't have anywhere else. So that's, I think, the second great avenue for camas, more and more cultivation in gardens. The third one, I think, is going to be in more of kind of like the fancy restaurant culture, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest. I think you're going to see more and more chefs experimenting with camas as an ingredient, making camas creme brulees and souffles and desserts, also integrating it into soups and mains and stuff, because as time goes by, there's more and more of a desire for tourists and people to kind of taste the place they're visiting. So if you were visiting the Pacific Northwest for somewhere else, you'd want to eat salmon, you'd want to eat maybe some clams, you'd want to eat maybe huckleberries, maybe some of our local fungi, that sort of thing. And I think camas could be a really interesting part of this kind of like high cuisine tourism culture. Not really my thing. It's a little bit rich for my blood, but I think that's cool. I think people who want to experiment with that, I think that's really neat. Remember, just because camas, comes out as a pretty tasty little bulb, that doesn't mean it has to end there, right? And like the cool thing about living in this global integrated world that we live in is that, people can experiment with ingredients from different cultures and use them in different ways and all that sort of thing. So I think we'll see maybe not, you won't see it everywhere, like you wouldn't see camas at McDonald's or the grocery store or something like that, but at least in like maybe high and local cuisine, you'd see more and more camas over time. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching this hour-and-a-half long video about a relatively obscure plant. It turns out you're a weird person. I'm sorry I had to break that to you. But heck, I made this giant video over many months, so what does that say about me? I guess you're in good company. It's just the world is so interesting, even a single plant, if you're willing to fully examine it. And remember, this plant, even though it doesn't mean that much to us nowadays in our modern world, entire civilizations hinged on this plant in the past. And I think that alone is reason enough to know a little something about it. So thank you for staying curious. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.